A very cheerful afternoon to one and all. I, Nidhi Baghel, welcome you all to this session of Orange City Literature Fest 2020. This session is on 2062, the world that artificial intelligence made with Toby Walsh in conversation with Kartik Borikar. Our speaker of this session, Toby Walsh, is a science chief professor of artificial intelligence at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia, and a fellow of the Australian Academy of Science. He was named by the Australian newspaper as a rock star of Australia's digital revolution. Professor Walsh is a strong advocate for limits to ensure artificial intelligence is used to improve our lives. He has, for example, been a leading voice in the discussion about killer robots, speaking at the UN in New York and Geneva on the topic. He appears regularly on TV and radio. He has authored two books on artificial intelligence for a general audience. The most recent title, 2062, The World That Artificial Intelligence Made, which is available in Arabic, Chinese, English, German, Japanese, Korean, Polish, Romanian, Russian, Turkish, and Vietnamese. The book has just been published in India by Speaking Tiger. Our moderator for the session, Kartik Borikar, is an entrepreneur with over 22 years of experience. His work focuses on research, development, and innovation in vehicle cleaning systems, cleaning chemicals, electronics, IoT, and AI. His specialization includes system development, international business development, crisis management, operations management, customer relationships management, CRM, and sales management. I am sure we are going to have a great session. I will remind you when the last 10 minutes of the session will be left with the help of a bell sound so that we can conclude the session smoothly in time. I now hand over to the moderator, Sir Karthik, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning to you, Toby, who joins us today from Sydney. As we all know, AI is everywhere these days, right from the email spam filter or to the self-driving cars. In fact, NASA is planning to build a city on Mars, which the AI-powered robots which actually build before we humans go over to Mars. So now, as everybody knows, like the computer software is a code which gives a particular output based on the input which we provide. For the young viewers and the people who know very little about AI, Toby, can you just shed some light on how different the AI programming is?
Of course, and let me say how sad I'm not to be there in person. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, I can't be in India at the moment. But I always have such a wonderful time. It's such a colourful, vibrant place, and I look forward to when the pandemic is over and I can return again. I was lucky to speak at the Jaipur Literary Festival in person a couple of years ago. It was a fantastic experience. I always look forward to the wonderful Indian food, so I can't wait till normal service. But in the meantime, it's wonderful to join you virtually. We have a great tradition in Australia when we speak at events to acknowledge the traditional owners, the custodians of the land on which we meet. I would actually like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation who own the land upon which I'm speaking. I'm speaking to you from, as you can see in the backdrop, Sydney, Australia, where it's a very hot day here. But to answer your question, what is artificial intelligence? How does it differ from normal programs? Well, it's very hard to define what artificial intelligence is. There's a lot of misconception, and that's why I wrote these books, these two books, the most recent 2062, about artificial intelligence, to try and actually help people understand a little more what it is. Because unfortunately, many ideas that you have, the sorts of ideas that you pick up from Hollywood movies, are rather fantastical and are a long way off in the future, if ever. And AI is already very much a transparent, hidden part of our lives. Every time that you ask Siri or Amazon Alexa a question, that's some artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is trying to get computers to do things when humans do them they require some intelligence. So that's understanding when someone speaks, answering their question. That's exactly what Siri does. That's exactly what Alexa does. It understands when you speak, it goes and looks up the answer on the web, and then reads back you the answer, or turns on the lights, or does it, whatever it is that you asked Siri or Alexa to do.
Yeah.
But equally, it's all the other hidden parts of AI that's starting to turn up in our lives every time that you get a book recommendation on some website. Well, that's a little AI program that knows something about people's preferences, maybe has learned little things about your preferences from the books that you've bought in the past, and is recommending you books that you hopefully might like in the future. And increasingly, it's turning up in other parts of our lives, and we're starting to see slowly but surely the introduction of autonomous cars, self-driving cars. That's again something that requires some intelligence to do. You had to learn how to drive a car, and we're teaching computers how to learn how to drive cars. And already today, in some places, at least, there are trials of the autonomous cars. If you hail a taxi in Singapore today, there's a good chance it will be an autonomous taxi that will pick you up and take you to your destination. It may take a bit longer, perhaps, for autonomous cars to arrive in India. I still have nightmares about being driven by taxi drivers in India, but I'm sure they will come, and they will be a great benefit in reducing some of the road deaths that we see, the million road deaths we see around the world every year, and the many road deaths perhaps that we see in India every year.
Right. So probably it'll take a much faster processor to process all the inputs of the traffic which come in.
But I did notice that traffic's a bit more free form in India than it is other places. So traffic, people seem to drive on both sides of the road, as far as I can see, and the following of road rules is a bit more liberal. It's a good example of why AI is such a challenge. I mean, even in places like the US or the UK, where people follow the rules a bit more strictly, it's still not written down exactly what you have to do. You can exceed the speed limit to overtake, for example, or if there's to avoid an accident, you're allowed to break the speed limit. You can cross the double white line if that's if you're overtaking, or and then the real challenge is what happens if you turn around a corner and then suddenly there's a cow in the middle of the street. What do you do? Should you drive into the cow with all the consequence that may have, or should you drive off the road into a brick wall? Maybe you're going to kill the occupants of the car in the process. It's not written down in any road rules exactly what you should do in a situation like that. And so the car's got to be programmed to make a decision, the right decision. And it highlights why it's such a challenge, is to all these implicit, tacit rules that you and I pick up and learn as when we learn to drive, that somehow we've got to pour into the machine so that the computer, the self-driving car, can do those same things.
Yeah. So actually, like coming to the AI thing, on our website, we actually use this AI-powered bot. And like earlier, it used to be so that we used to actually give the keywords to the bot, and it used to actually recognize that keyword and then give a response accordingly. But now with the Google Dialogflow, which came just about a year or so back, it actually understands what the user is saying, each and everything, even if...
Well, I'm going to disagree with you. It doesn't quite understand it. It's a passable attempt at understanding, but what's important to understand is two things. Two important things about that. First of all, now you're not having to program explicitly all the keywords it's going to pick up and all the way the conversation is going to flow. It's much more intuitive at picking up the conversation and answering people's questions. And how that's happened is using what we call machine learning. That we're not programming with explicit rules and explicit instructions of what the machine does. We're giving it lots of examples of past conversations, and it learns how to have a conversation. Which, if you think about it, that's how much of your intelligence came about. You were, when you were born, the most things you couldn't do. You couldn't read or write. You couldn't speak. You didn't have any real language. All those are things that you learned by being exposed to lots of examples, and you picked up how to speak, how to answer conversations, how to read, how to do maths, how to drive a car, all those things. Most of the things that you do that require intelligence were things you learned. And so what's interesting is that we're actually getting computers to do the same thing. We're giving lots of examples, and they're learning to do these things. So it's a lot less programming and a lot more exposing them to examples of these things. But the other point is to understand that it's today, at least, it's very much at a statistical level. It's learning statistics of language. It doesn't really have a very deep understanding of language. I mean, so Google Translate is an example, again, of one of these systems. If you translate between a pair of languages, Google Translate is using machine learning to do that now. It's lots of examples of English and Hindi or English and Chinese, and it learns how to do the connections between those two languages. But it doesn't have it's learning very much at a statistical level. So if you give it a sentence like, he is pregnant, and ask it to translate it into Hindi or into Chinese, it will go away and translate it. It will give you the most statistically common word for he, most statistically common word for is, and then the most statistically common word for pregnant. It doesn't understand what you've already understood, which is there's something deeply troubling about that sentence that Tobys just told me. He is pregnant. Men don't get pregnant. So why are you talking about, well, unless they're seahorses. I believe the seahorse is the one species of animal where the male actually becomes pregnant. But apart from seahorses, that one little exception in nature, the males of species don't get pregnant, it's the females. And so there's something a bit odd about that sentence, he is pregnant. Google Translate will translate it without knowing, thinking of seahorses, thinking something odd about that sentence. Because it's just understanding at a statistical level. It doesn't really deeply understand. It's not thinking of that mental picture that you've got about men being pregnant, thinking, well, that's going to be a rather strange world, and probably the human race would end quite quickly if men had to become pregnant. There would be lots of problems with that. So we're lucky that doesn't happen. So it's worth realizing that we've still got a long way to go before machines truly understand language. They make a plausible imitation of understanding, but it's very easy to trip them up.
Probably that's the reason we still have to call it a bot, still, because it does make a lot of mistakes. It
does, but if you pick a narrow domain, so it's repairing bicycles or answering queries about your travel website. It can do a plausibly good job. At least it can answer the first round of questions, be a first line of defense for that company. And then if the questions are more sophisticated or more complex, then you can pass on to a human operator. Many of the routine things can be answered by a bot. And there are lots of settings where that's a good thing. That will maybe save you money. But there are lots of settings where people want to talk about sensitive or private information. There are lots of examples where, for example, people want to talk about medical conditions that are somewhat embarrassing, where actually people prefer to speak to a bot, and we can take that knowledge of a doctor, and this is why I say to people, where one of the greatest promises of technologies like AI is that we can take first world health knowledge. I mean, the people are dying every day, sadly in India, sadly in Africa, of things that we know how to fix, that take pennies to fix. And because we don't have that expertise out there in the villages, but we could put such information on a smartphone with a bot, so anyone could talk to it, and take that first world health knowledge and provide it at almost no cost into the developing world. And that is an example, I think, of the great promise that artificial intelligence offers of democratizing knowledge and providing healthcare and solutions into developing countries that I'm very lucky in a country like Australia to take for granted such expertise, that can be democratized and provided in the form of medical bots.
Yeah, actually, there was one study which was done. You talked about the medical thing. There was a rare case of cancer, which actually all the reports were fed into the program as a training data. And it was told that this kind of thing was seen in this kind of cancer. and it went through about say 100,000 records, and it found one person where it was plausible that this person could have that kind of cancer, and actually that person was found to have that particular cancer in his body. So that's somewhere where nobody would have scanned or gone through 100,000 documents just to find that one person.
Yes, well, I mean, that's the example of how science as a whole, but medicine in particular, is going to evolve, which is that you're not going to be able to keep it. You can't, it's already today, it's impossible to read all the scientific literature, to keep on top of especially a field like cancer.
Yeah.
There are too many papers published every day that if you spent your whole day just reading,
Yeah.
you still not finish the day. There'll be more papers published in the course of the day than you'd actually been able to read. So we
Right.
can actually hope to be on top of this. And that's also why it's an interesting example, because it also illustrates why AIs are going to be smarter than us, because they'll be better read than us. Well, maybe they won't think any better than us. Maybe they won't make any better decisions than us. But they'll have broader knowledge. So we've already seen this. For example, there was an expert systems written to look at blood diseases. And it became better than the very best world's experts. And they poured in the knowledge of these world's experts in different forms of pulmonary disease. And it was no better than any one of them and any one of those narrow aspects of blood disease. But it had a broader expertise than any one of them had on their
Right.
own, any one human doctor had on their own. And so it got to be better than any human doctor because it had a broader knowledge. And we see this in many other settings, is that the machines can process more information than human eyes can possibly look at in a lifetime of studying medicine. And therefore, even if their decisions aren't any better, they can be assistants that can help doctors make better
Right.
decisions, because they just know the literature broader and deeper than any human possibly could.
Now, this was all the good part of AI, basically. So
Yeah.
there was an interesting Tamil movie in India where there's an actor called Rajnikant. So the movie's name is Robot, and it was with artificial intelligence and emotional intelligence. And by the end of the story, what happens is this robot actually takes over the control of the entire thing. He makes thousands of robots like himself, and then actually they come behind all the humans and trying to destroy the city and all those things. So a typical robot kind of movie.
Yes, a very typical kind of robot movie, and one that not only Bollywood but Hollywood puts out all the time.
Yeah.
One reason why I wrote these books was to try and dispel these myths, so that you and all our viewers tonight can sleep easily, knowing that the robots aren't going to rise up and take over anytime soon, if ever. It's worth pointing out that the machines have no sentience, have no consciousness. They have no desires of their own. They are machines. They do only what we tell them to do. And actually, normally that's the problem. We haven't thought carefully through what we've told them to do. And anyone who's had the fortune or misfortune to program computers will know how frustratingly literal computers are. They do exactly what you tell them to do. They have no common sense. Then they just blindly follow those instructions. So there's not going to be any mischievous glint in a robot's eye anytime soon. I mean, it's not clear that we'll ever build machines that have any consciousness. I mean, it's an interesting question. It's an interesting challenge. Will machines ever develop anything like human consciousness? They certainly have nothing like that today. So we have nothing to fear about. We're a long way away from machines having human-like intelligence. They may have narrow, focused intelligence in narrow domains, but we've still got a long way to go before they match human intelligence. And certainly, whether when they get that human intelligence, they have any consciousness of their own, any desires of their own. It's not at all clear. And that's still a long way away before they match our intelligence. And that actually explains the title of the book, 2062. That's when I surveyed 300 of my colleagues, other experts in AI, asked them when machines might match humans in their intelligence. And the average answer they said was 2062. So about 40 or 50 years' time. I should point out there was huge uncertainty in the answers. It's not going to happen on November the 29th at 12:30 p.m. On 2062. We really don't know when it's going to happen. Most people said it was going to happen in the next 50 or 100 years. But what's important to understand is none of my colleagues were saying it's going to happen in the next 10 years. It's still a huge, great distance to go to match human intelligence. I have huge respect for the human brain. We're still only making very, very modest amounts of intelligence in our machines and only doing very narrow tasks. But equally, very few of them said it was going to take more than a century. It's something that's going to happen in the lifetime of our children, and if we're lucky enough, maybe in our lifetimes. And so I think it's really important to think about, well, what's the consequences of having such smart machines around that can do all the dull, difficult, dangerous tasks in our lives and free us up to focus on the things that are important for us. So I'm not overly worried that the machines are going to rise up and take over. Actually, I'm much more worried about the stupid intelligence that we're building in machines today, that we're giving responsibility to machines that aren't actually smart enough to have that responsibility, and blindly following instructions. And we already see plentiful examples of people who have followed the stupid intelligence, and the Joshua Brown, who was the unfortunate person to be killed by his Tesla car, who trusted in its autonomy, its self-driving too much. When it drove into a truck, it wasn't capable enough of being given the responsibility of driving without his oversight. And he was a fine example of how humans will give responsibility to machines that aren't capable of. And so that actually the book 2062 is mostly a description of how we need to be careful about giving too much responsibility to machines too quickly before they're capable enough of taking on that responsibility, whether that be self-driving cars or whether that be in other aspects of our lives. So you shouldn't worry too much about what movie makers will make you worry about. It's much more mundane things, and there are plentiful mundane things about how machines might take over work, how machines might corrupt our political discourse, how machines might change many aspects of our lives. It's the stupid machines we already get today and in the near future, and before we get to the robots that are going to plan to take over the planet, if that ever happens at all.
Yeah. Like before this session, actually, we were discussing about the defense thing.
Yes.
What if the robot is actually programmed to harm the humans, and actually the three laws of robotics are not followed? And what's your take on that?
Asimov's famous laws of robotics, that a robot should not harm a human being or by inaction allow a human to harm. The second law, a robot must follow any instructions unless it violates the previous laws, and so on. Yes, this is something that I do lose sleep over, and something that I'm very pleased that we get to talk about, because it's something that we're already seeing. We're already seeing the development of AI in the battlefield. It's something that scientists like myself have been warning about for a number of years. As was mentioned in the introduction by Nidhi, I have actually had the good fortune to go and speak at the United Nations on this topic half a dozen times, and to warn about the dangers, the risks of handing over such decisions as to who lives and who dies to machines. The machines aren't capable of making these moral decisions. It would take us to a very dark place. It would cross a red line if we did hand that over. And something that we've been warning about for a number of years. And unfortunately, we're seeing an arms race starting to happen with the use of AI in warfare, with handing over these sorts of life or death decisions to machines without adequate human oversight. And already this year, in fact, I'm sad to report that we saw on the Turkish-Syrian border, we saw Turkey field for the first time some fully autonomous drones, kamikaze drones, that use face recognition software. So the same sort of face recognition software that's in your smartphone, that will open your smartphone, that's used in stores, that's used in immigration at airports, is now being used to target people and decide who to kill on the ground. And these drones will packed with a small amount of high explosives and will fly into the person on the ground and blow them up. And that's taking us to a very dark place, and one where I would hope actually we have, like we have other technologies, decide to limit the use of technology. Well, there's actually a wide range of technologies that we have decided to regulate. We regulate biological weapons, chemical weapons, even nuclear weapons. The nuclear weapon ban has now just been passed. 50 nations have ratified the treaty at the United Nations just a couple of weeks ago. The 50th nation ratified the treaty, so it's now gone into international law. To make the world a safer place, we've decided to ban cluster munitions, to ban blinding lasers. And this is a technology I hope that we will decide to ban. There are talks ongoing at the United Nations that looking at how we could regulate these technologies. It's really important for a country like India. You sit in a very delicate place. You've got borders with Pakistan and with China, which are flashpoints for potential conflicts. And sadly, China is one of the nations that is pushing forward these technologies and might well be arming Pakistan with such autonomous drones that could escalate these conflicts. If you're not able to defend yourself against these swarms of drones coming at you, you might then have to move to the next stage, and it might disastrously precipitate the beginning of a nuclear conflict. If you're not able to defend yourselves against these weapons, then you might have to move to the next extent. So I'm hopeful that politicians in your region will realize the danger, the potential flashpoints that these weapons could destabilize already somewhat unstable zones. And we already see plentiful flashes happening in these zones. And so we should think very carefully before we go down this road. And we do get a window of opportunity. We are at a moment where these weapons aren't widely deployed, and they're still, most of them are under development. But it is something that is going to be used. There will be weapons that will fall into the hands of terrorists. They'll be used by rogue states. One of the real challenges of these weapons is that it will be very hard to know who's attacking you, because there'll be a swarm of drones come at you. They won't. If you bring the drone down, you won't know who is behind the drones. You'll open them up and they'll say Intel chips. So you won't know who brought those chips and put them in there. Who's behind these attacks. We've already seen this. There was a drone attack on a Russian base in Syria, and it's not clear who was behind the attack. We're not actually clear who was behind it. It's very difficult to attribute who's behind the attack. Again, that's another destabilizing, dangerous aspect of these technologies. That people will, when they'll be used, they're picked up by terrorists and rogue states and used in dangerous ways. And of course, used not just to fight against other robots or to fight against other military people, but to use, as we've seen with so many other weapons, to be used against civilians, to be used against women and children. And these will be the perfect weapons of terror because they will follow instructions, however evil those instructions are, to the letter. I mean that's the previously, if you wanted to do harm, you had to persuade people to do that harm for you. You had to investigate your soldiers, but now you'd have this terrible weapon that would follow whatever instruction was in its code.
Exactly. So I think. Okay, so actually, for all the viewers, Toby has written a couple more than like. I have a list of about, say, 5.
Well, there's actually only 2 books I've written for the general public, but in different countries, the publishers decided to use different titles. So one's called It's Alive, which is a history of AI from its beginning back in. It's interesting if you actually study where it comes from. You can trace it back to the ancient Greeks and philosophers who have been thinking for thousands of years about the nature of thought and whether we could mechanize that through the invention of the computer to where we stand today. And then the second book, the more recent book that's just come out in India, published by Speaking Tiger, 2062, which, as the title suggests, is looking at the future. Is looking at not at the technology, not trying to explain what the technology does. Because as I said in the book, it's going to appear like magic. There's a famous quote from Arthur C. Clarke, a science fiction author who was someone who inspired me as a young boy to follow the field. Who said that any sufficiently advanced technology is going to look like magic, and AI is going to look like magic in 2062. But the 2062 is about the impact it's going to have on our society, the impact it's going to have on the nature of work, on the nature of privacy in our lives, the nature of politics. Was one chapter on warfare. We've already talked about that. And how we can make sure that this is a technology that all of us are lifted by. That's certainly been the case of past revolutions. The Industrial Revolution in the past has been used to lift the quality of many people's lives. And it's in these difficult times, it's worth remembering that progress of technology has been to lift the quality of most people's lives on the planet. 1 billion people have been lifted out of extreme poverty in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
Even in India, the quality of life has improved. Life expectancy has gone up quite significantly. And to make sure that we do use these technologies again to continue that progress of lifting people's lives, and making sure that everyone in India, everyone in China, everyone in the West has their lives lifted. And that, I think the book makes an important point, which is that I think people make a mistake. They ask people like myself, well, how are these technologies going to change our lives? And I'd like to remind people that the future is not fixed. The future is the product of the choices that we make today. There are many possible futures available. The technology will open out many opportunities for us. And we get to choose exactly how those technologies get used, and how we spread the benefits around, or whether we do spread the benefits around or not. And so the book is actually the point of the book really is to actually suggest we should have these important conversations about making the choices, making sure that we share the benefits around everyone, and making sure that we use the technologies in a way that lifts the quality of life of people. It's been 2020 has been a very interesting, very challenging, very challenging year with the pandemic and all the other things like the climate emergency, ongoing climate emergency. And I take some positive heart from at least one part of 2020, which is that we've realized how we do get to invent the future. And we've seen this in many countries. We've seen quite radical policies where people have been paid to stay at home, and we've locked up people to protect the poor and the elderly and the sick, and to realise that actually there are some quite radical choices being made by politicians around the world to deal with these challenges. And AI is going to require equally interesting and challenging choices to be made.
Nidhi, do we have any questions?
Shall I read the questions for you?
Please do.
Yeah, please go ahead.
There's this one question from the audience that, do you think artificial intelligence will lead to human extinction?
No, humans will lead to human extinction. I think we're doing a pretty good job of extincting ourselves, whether that be the climate emergency or the sustainability of the planet or even the pandemic. We're not doing a particularly good job of looking after ourselves. So I think the challenge for humanity is for us to make the right decisions. AI is a technology that can be used for good or for bad. And it's about the human choices, like it is about the human choices, how we deal with the pandemic, the human choices, how we deal with the climate emergency. And so the real challenge is whether we have the intelligence, the human intelligence, to deal with all these immense challenges. People ask me if I'm optimistic or pessimistic, and I always say to them, I'm optimistic in the long term. And we've always risen ultimately to the challenge, but I'm somewhat pessimistic in the short term. And we've seen this with the pandemic. We've seen this with the climate emergency, and I fear we'll see the same with the adoption of AI. Is that we'll have to see some of the pain first before we have the foresight, the courage, and the conviction to do the right thing. But we've always managed somehow to use our intelligence to do the right thing in the long term, even if we haven't had the intelligence to do the right thing from the start. So I'm optimistic, even if it's going to be a bumpy 50 or 100 years as we go through. I mean, it's interesting to remember, people were starting to talk about the end of history, how we're all converging on the same enlightened capitalist states, and that turned out to be somewhat of a false dawn. So I do think we face some really wicked challenges, but equally, if we are going to chase some of these wicked challenges, like the climate emergency, like using the planet in a more sustainable way, the only way we're going to do that now, we were too late for clearly political solutions, is by embracing technology. And AI is one of those technologies that's going to help us use the planet in a more sustainable way. So in some sense, we are going to have to embrace technology. It's the only way that we live better quality lives than our grandparents did, is that we embrace technology. We embraced vaccines, we've embraced medicine, we've embraced all the technologies that have allowed us to feed more mouths and to deal with things like childhood death. I mean, it's worth remembering, a third of people used to die before the age of 10. But because we've used our medical knowledge, now it's less than 1 in 5. That's still 1 in 5 too many. And I hope it's going to be 1 in 20 and then 1 in 100. And we will continue the inexorable progress by embracing technologies like AI, so that we can deal with all these wicked problems.
Any other question, Nidhi?
Yes, there's one more question. Is it possible that artificial intelligence can surpass human intelligence?
That's a wonderful question. I think it would be terribly conceited to say it couldn't. Human intelligence is just one point on a spectrum. I mean, what is human intelligence? There's not take a room full of people, you've got a room full of different intelligences. It's not one point that's human intelligence. Are we trying to surpass the smartest person who's alive today, the smartest person who ever lived? I think it would be terribly conceited to think that we couldn't pass human intelligence. And we already have some evidence that that's likely to be the case. Because if we pick a narrow focus task, reading X-rays, playing the ancient Chinese game of Go or the game of chess, translating English into Mandarin, we can already write a computer program that does one of those individual tasks at a speed, an accuracy, or a quality of decision in some cases that surpasses humans. Now, we can't, of course, yet write a computer program that does everything humans do, but I'm pretty confident in 50 or 100 years' time that it's very likely that we will certainly do all the intellectual things that we do. And of course, that leaves other things. I mean, our intelligence is a very multidimensional thing. There are many different aspects to our intelligence. There's our and we're certainly a long distance away from being able to replicate that emotional intelligence, that social intelligence, and that creativity. But we're slowly starting to build machines that understand human emotions, that understand creativity, and that can do certain limited forms of creativity themselves. So I'm also confident in the long term that we'll be able to match and no doubt exceed those human abilities in those particular areas. Now, that leaves many things still, I think, for humans. Even if we've got machines that can exceed humans in many tasks, I don't think that the machines are going to replace us in every aspect, for a number of reasons. One is because we're social animals. We like interacting with each other. It's much more fun for me to come and talk to you than it is for me to talk to a robot. So I'm having much more fun talking to you. Hopefully you're having much more fun listening to me as a human than listening to a robot telling you about artificial intelligence. So we're going to prefer interacting with other humans. And all those social things are not going to go away. So whilst we might have a robot doctor, we're still going to want to have human doctors that help understand and interpret the robot doctors for us. And then when we look at things like creativity, maybe we're going to be able to write programs that write novels, the right plays that perhaps match the great plays of Shakespeare or the great poets of India. But they're not going to mean as much to us. A robot's never going to fall in love, and a robot's never going to die, and a robot's never going to lose a loved one. I mean, robots are going to be immortal. They don't fall in love. They don't have our biochemistry. So that it's never going to be as meaningful for us, the poems that robots write, because they won't speak to human experiences. They'll speak to robot experiences, which will be different. Robot poetry is perhaps going to be more meaningful to other robots. Human poetry is still going to speak to us. They're going to speak across, the poetry that speaks across generations to us from other humans who've lived similar experiences can speak to us about the human condition. So there are plentiful things where even if robots can write poetry that on the surface level matches human poetry, it's not going to mean as much to us. So there's lots of things I think left for us. And hopefully the robots can take all the sweat. They can generate all the wealth and all the food and the clothes and house us, and we can sit back and enjoy the finer things in life, hanging out with our families, with our friends, writing poetry, reading poetry, eating fine Indian food, making fine Indian food, all the things that are meaningful to us.
Yeah. I think we're just about the time. So it was a phenomenal talk. Now I'm surely going to read your book, 2062, The World That AI Made. And I implore everybody else also to go and buy it on Amazon or maybe your nearest bookstore and read this book. It is really interesting. So,
Great. Well, please, everyone keep safe. Stay at home and read a book. That's the best thing you can do, I reckon, at this point in time.
Yeah. Over to you, Nidhi.
Thank you, Walsh sir, for sharing your knowledge. Thank you, Kartik sir, for steering the conversation so beautifully. On behalf of the Orange City Literature Fest, we sincerely express our gratitude towards your acceptance for the session and knowledge shared with us. Special thanks to SGR Knowledge Foundation. I would also like to acknowledge our publisher, Speaking Tiger. The next session on Cancer Never Kills, the sweet taste of survival and how to experience is scheduled from 1 p.m. Have a nice day.
20 years of existence. 2 universities. 23 educational institutes. Offering 137 courses. Raisoni Group of Institutions. A vision beyond.